At 9:14 on a Thursday morning, she logged into the pension portal and saw a number she didn't recognize. Not the balance, the destination. There, in the transaction history, beneath her late husband's name, beneath the decades of contributions deducted from factory paychecks and overtime shifts, and all the years he used to call the part where we build a safe future, was a transfer request she had never meant to authorize all the way through. Status. Processed. She clicked it once. Then again, harder, like pressure, might change the words. A second line loaded underneath. External disbursement completed. For a few seconds, nothing in her body reacted. No gasp, no shaking, just the dull administrative language of a website, deciding the rest of her life in plain gray text. The amount was large enough that her eyes refused to hold it. It didn't look like money. It looked like a formatting error. Then her phone vibrated. A message from him. Don't panic. This is a protection step I told you about. The funds are clearing through the legal hold. If you interfere now, it could freeze everything. She stared at those words longer than she stared at the missing pension. Not because she believed them fully, because part of her still wanted to. She opened her chat thread and watched a little check mark sit under her last message from earlier that morning. Can you confirm this is normal? No typing bubble appeared. She called. The number that had worked every night for 3 months now went straight to a voicemail she had never heard before. Not his voice. A sterile automated recording telling her the user was unavailable. She called again. Same result. Then she did what people do when they already know and still need one final injury to prove it. She went back to the grief forum where they met, found his profile, and clicked. The account was gone. Not renamed. Not suspended. Gone in a clean, silent way that only digital things can disappear. No forwarding address. No explanation. No residue except your own memory insisting it had been real. That was the moment the room changed. Not when she saw the transfer. Not when he stopped answering. When she realized the place where he first said, I know exactly what it feels like to wake up and still expect him to be there, had erased him so completely it almost suggested he had never existed at all. Her husband's pension was the last intact structure of the life they had built together. The house was already under pressure. The medical bills had consumed the savings. The casseroles had stopped. The sympathy texts had thinned out into holiday check-ins and then silence. That pension was not abstract. It was groceries, heating, prescriptions, property tax, and the one thing grief had not managed to destabilize. Now a stranger was telling her not to panic, while the final piece of her husband's legacy vanished into an account she couldn't trace. She called the pension administrator. She called the bank. She wrote down every confirmation number with a pen that kept slipping in her hand. And before anyone could explain how this had happened, one question had already taken over everything. How does a woman end up trusting a stranger with the last thing her dead husband left behind? 3 months earlier, she was not looking for love or money or help with the pension. She was looking for language. That was the part no one tells you about early widowhood. People think grief is emotion, but at first it's logistics. Forms, death certificates, canceling appointments that still arrive by text under his name, calling customer service lines and hearing yourself say, my husband passed away, until the sentence loses all meaning and somehow becomes more violent each time. Then the paperwork starts to thin out, and that's when the silence gets dangerous. Her husband had been dead for 11 months, long enough that the public sympathy had expired, too short for the grief to become manageable. Friends had returned to ordinary life with understandable kindness. Her sister still checked in, but carefully, as if one wrong question might crack the day open. Even the people who loved her most had started treating her grief like weather. Unfortunate, lingering, but no longer an emergency. Nights were the worst. Not because she cried every night. Sometimes she didn't cry at all. Sometimes she just sat in the half-lit living room with the television on mute and felt the house around her as a shape built for 2 people that now made no sense for one. That was when she found the forum. It wasn't one of the big social platforms. It was smaller, cleaner, and somehow more intimate because of that. A digital support space built specifically for people navigating bereavement. Threads were organized by type of loss, time since death, age, practical issues, anniversaries. There were rooms for anger, guilt, paperwork, insomnia, rooms for people who felt relieved, rooms for people who felt nothing, rooms for people ashamed of how much they were still hurting. She read for days before posting. At first, she only scrolled. Stories about hospital rooms, sudden losses, long illnesses, the strange cruelty of hearing a dead person's voicemail. She noticed how precise the language was there. Nobody said everything happens for a reason. Nobody told you he would want you to move on. People spoke in details, and the details felt safe. One evening, close to midnight, she wrote her first post. It wasn't dramatic, just honest. She wrote that she missed the administrative parts of marriage almost as much as the emotional ones. The second set of hands, the person who knew the password she forgot, the bill due dates, which drawer held the warranty papers, the exact wording on the pension documents. She wrote that what frightened her most was not being heartbroken, but being solely responsible for all the things he used to quietly manage. Within an hour, replies appeared. Some were generic, some kind. One stood apart. His message was precise in a way that startled her. He didn't say, "I understand your pain." He said, "The most disorienting part is losing the witness to your life. The only person who knows why certain papers are folded the way they are, why one account has a strange security question, why a routine task suddenly feels impossible." She read it twice, then a third time. It was the specificity that got through. Not romance, not flattery, recognition. His profile said he had lost his wife the year before. He wrote carefully, never too much. He seemed to know the etiquette of grief spaces. No forced optimism, no theatrical suffering, no advice unless asked. He answered other people too, not just her. That mattered. It made him look real. Over the next week, she started noticing him everywhere in the forum. A reply under a thread about sleep, a thoughtful comment in a discussion about guilt, a private mention of how people disappear after the funeral. Not because they're cruel, but because the grieving make others confront their own fragility. It felt less like meeting someone new than discovering someone had already been standing in the same emotional weather. When he finally suggested they continue the conversation more privately, just so they wouldn't have to write so personally in public, it didn't feel like an escalation. It felt like relief. And because the audience already knows where this goes, that small moment carries more weight than it did then. At the time, she thought she was stepping into a safer conversation. She had no idea she was stepping out of the last room where anyone else could see him. The first red flag did not look red at all. It looked considerate. Once they moved into private messages, the tone shifted almost immediately, not into anything overtly romantic, not at first. It became more focused, more constant, more responsive. He was suddenly there at exactly the right moments. If she posted in the forum, he messaged to ask if she was okay. If she mentioned not sleeping, he was awake too. If she disappeared for half a day, he returned with a note that made it sound as though her silence had been noticed gently, carefully, by someone who understood that silence was often the real symptom. This is how manipulation works in high emotion spaces. It rarely begins with pressure. It begins with precision. He remembered details. The brand of tea her husband used to drink. The fact that she hated the phrase closure. The way she once described the pension paperwork as the last machine in the house still running on his instructions. That line came back to her later, at the worst possible time. But in those early weeks, it made her feel seen in a way almost nobody else had managed. And then came the small suggestion. Not a demand, not even a request. Exactly. More like a shared understanding. He told her that grief forums could be helpful, but also dangerous in a different way. That public threads often attracted people who performed healing instead of living it. He said some members could be judgmental about how others handle practical matters after a death. He told her he'd learned to protect the more delicate parts of his grieving life from spectators. There was the first real pivot. He wasn't just moving the conversation into private. He was redefining privacy as safety and visibility as risk. If she had stepped back then, the whole thing might have ended as a strange online friendship. But by then, his presence had woven itself into the hours of her day. Morning check-ins, late-night reflections, quiet reassurance after difficult calls with pension administrators and insurance offices. He did not overwhelm her with affection. He did something more effective. He became routine. The first moment that should have stopped everything came during a call. Up to then, most of their communication had been through messages. A thoughtful, measured, intimate in that text-based way that makes people sound more composed than they are. When he suggested speaking voice to voice, she hesitated only briefly. By then, hearing him felt natural. His voice was warm, slightly tired, soft in all the right places. But something about the rhythm felt off. Not robotic, not enough to trigger panic, just oddly controlled, as if every pause had been selected. He mirrored her phrasing too perfectly. When she spoke about her husband, he reflected back not just the feeling but the structure of her sentence, as if he had studied the emotional architecture of her grief and learned how to inhabit it. Then, near the end of that call, she said something simple. "Maybe I'll mention you to my sister. She'll be relieved I'm finally talking to someone." He went quiet for a beat too long. Then he laughed softly and said, "You can, of course. I just know how people get. The second they hear you've connected with someone online, they turn it into a warning story. And suddenly the one thing helping you feel less alone gets contaminated by everyone else's fear." It was subtle. No command. No anger. But it changed the air. He had introduced an alternative frame before anyone else could. If her sister seemed skeptical later, that skepticism would not feel protective. It would feel intrusive, misinformed, harmful to a fragile connection. That was a red flag. Not secrecy itself, but how elegantly he prepared her to defend it. She still could have pulled away. The signs were there. The private channel. The emotional exclusivity. The discomfort around other people knowing he existed. But grief distorts calibration. When someone appears to understand your pain with unusual accuracy, your mind starts treating familiarity as proof. And once familiarity feels like proof, caution starts to look cruel. By the end of that week, she was no longer just talking to someone who understood loss. She was protecting the connection from anyone who might question it. And that was exactly the point. The first irreversible action did not feel irreversible. It felt administrative. That is one of the reasons these scams succeed. People imagine disaster arrives with dramatic demands. Wire money now. Send everything. Trust me completely. But in real life, the lock clicks earlier and more quietly. Often at the exact moment, the victim still believes they are being careful. By the 6th week, he had become part of the infrastructure of her grief. Not a fantasy. Not even, in her mind, a romance yet. More like a private stabilizer. The person who knew which days were harder, which calls she had been avoiding, which documents still sat unopened on the dining table. He had positioned himself not as a rescuer, but as someone walking beside her through tasks that felt unbearable alone. That was important, because when the conversation turned practical, it did not feel like a change in relationship. It felt like a continuation of support. The trigger was small. She mentioned, almost casually, that she had received another letter about the survivor pension review. The wording confused her. There were references to verification deadlines, beneficiary status, and a temporary hold on distribution options if certain identity confirmations were not completed correctly. It wasn't unusual. Financial institutions communicate in a dialect designed to make ordinary people feel underqualified. He responded almost instantly. He said he had dealt with something similar after his wife died. Same delays, same cold language, same bureaucratic maze. He told her not to panic. These places often created extra friction around legacy assets, especially when there were transitions after a death. Then he said the sentence that moved everything forward. "If you want, I can help you read it the way they mean it, not the way they write it." That line mattered because it preserved her dignity. He wasn't taking over. He was translating. She sent him a photo of the first page, then the second, then the section with the account references. Even that by itself should have raised alarms. She knew better than to share financial paperwork with strangers. But by then he no longer felt like a stranger. He felt like the only person in her life who understood both the grief and the paperwork attached to it. He pointed out a phrase in a letter about authentication and said institutions often use third-party legal verification partners for contested or vulnerable disbursements. He spoke in a calm, practiced way, as if he had spent months untangling the same process. He never rushed. That was part of the trap. Urgency would have sounded like a scam. Patience sounded like legitimacy. A day later, he told her he knew someone, a legal assistant. He called her, who specialized in estate-side pension complications. Not a lawyer taking over the case. Just someone who could tell her whether the whole language in the letter was routine or dangerous. Again, he made it sound smaller than it was. The assistant emailed from an address that looked credible at first glance. The message was clean, professional. It referenced the institution by name, used the correct formatting for beneficiary language, and laid out a simple list of items needed to confirm continuity of access and avoid a prolonged freeze. What they asked for was not money. That's why she did it. They asked for account screenshots, confirmation of beneficiary identity, and later, a secure login validation step, so they could view the whole conditions in real time. The explanation was plausible enough to pass through the exhausted part of her brain that had been making difficult decisions alone for nearly a year. She hesitated only once. When the assistant asked her to stay on message while completing a verification sequence inside the portal, she felt a flicker of discomfort, not fear, just a sense that she was crossing from discussing documents into allowing access. She messaged him separately. "This still seems okay, right?" He answered within seconds. "Yes, this is the annoying part. But once they remove the hold, you won't have to keep reliving this paperwork every month." That was the emotional lever, not financial confidence. Relief. So she did it. She entered the credentials, confirmed the code, followed the prompts, approved what she believed was a temporary verification action tied to securing her survivor access. There was no alarm, no dramatic theft, no instant disappearance of funds. When it was done, the portal looked normal, and because nothing visibly broke in that moment, she believed she had passed through a bureaucratic headache, not handed a stranger the keys to the last stable asset her husband had left behind. The first commitment had been made, not with a wire transfer, with trust translated into authorization. For 48 hours after she gave them access, nothing bad happened. That was not accidental. If the account had emptied immediately, panic would have cut through the emotional fog. She would have called the pension administrator, the bank, her sister, maybe even the police, before shame had time to settle in. But a well-designed scam does not always reward itself at once. Sometimes it allows a quiet interval, just long enough for the victim to interpret survival as proof. And in that gap, she relaxed. The legal assistant sent a follow-up email, saying the review appeared to be progressing normally. There was mention of a temporary routing adjustment, language about compliance checks, and one carefully soothing sentence. At this stage, the assets are being secured against interruption, while beneficiary continuity is finalized. She read that line 3 times. Being secured. It was exactly the phrase her nervous system wanted. Not moved, not exposed, not vulnerable. Secured. The kind of word institutions use when they are helping you. The kind of word a person in grief clings to because it implies someone competent is protecting what she can't protect alone. He reinforced it that evening. They spoke by voice, and he sounded calm, almost gently amused that she had worried. He told her these systems often look scarier from the outside because they were designed for liability, not clarity. He said once the hold cleared, she might even have cleaner access than before. Less paperwork, fewer interruptions, a more stable arrangement going forward. He was not promising riches. He was offering order. That made it more believable. For the first time in weeks, she slept through the night. The next morning, she logged into the portal and saw a new notation attached to the account. Not a zero balance, not an obvious withdrawal, just an internal status update reflecting pending movement under administrative review. It matched what she had been told closely enough to feel reassuring. Technical, though unremarkable. The visual language of legitimate process. This is a stage where victims often become active participants in their own calming. She started explaining the situation to herself in his words. The transfer language was procedural. The hold was temporary. The outside review was protective. The strange account routing must be part of the legal channel. She no longer needed him to invent certainty from scratch. She was doing part of that work herself now, because the alternative was too destabilizing to hold. Even when a tiny inconsistency appeared, she filed it under stress. The assistant's email signature looked slightly different from the previous one. The portal notification used a phrase she didn't remember seeing in pension documents before. His message response time slowed for half a day after being almost unnervingly immediate for weeks. Any one of those details, isolated and examined, might have broken the spell. But false recovery is powerful because it doesn't erase doubt. It domesticates it. It turns suspicion into something manageable, something you can postpone, because the overall narrative still feels intact. And there was another reason she wanted to believe everything was stabilizing. She had started imagining what normal might look like after this. Not a new life, not happiness exactly, but a little less chaos. The pension sorted out, the house manageable, fewer letters she didn't understand. Someone to talk to who knew the difference between missing a person and drowning in the administration left behind by their death. She had not named it yet, but emotionally she was already investing beyond the paperwork. That is why the false recovery matters so much in stories like this. It doesn't just delay the reveal. It raises the emotional price of the reveal. Because when the collapse comes, the victim is not only losing money, she is losing the brief, intoxicating belief that maybe the worst was over. Late that afternoon, he sent one more reassuring message. You did the hard part. Now, just don't let the system spook you while the funds are clearing. Temporary movement can look dramatic before it settles. At the time, it felt like guidance. Later, she would understand it for what it really was. Advance permission to ignore the evidence when it finally appeared. When the first bank representative told her the transfer had been authorized from her own session credentials, the story became harder to survive. Until then, there was still a version of events in which she had been hacked in some abstract, impersonal way. A breach, a technical intrusion, something external that might be solved by fraud departments and escalation teams, and the ordinary machinery designed to protect consumers from strangers. But authorized changed the shape of the disaster. Authorized meant the system believed she had done it. Authorized meant the institution's first instinct was not rescue, but review. Authorized meant every explanation she gave would have to cross an invisible threshold where grief starts sounding, to other people like negligence. The pension administrator asked if anyone else had been present when she completed the verification steps. The bank asked if she had willingly shared credentials. Another representative, speaking in the careful tone companies use when they know they may be legally recording your ruin, asked whether she had been guided by a third party. Guided, such a harmless word for a mechanism of destruction. She kept trying to explain that she had not intended to release the funds, only verify the account, that she believed she was protecting the pension, not moving it, that there had been mention of legal review and a hold and continuity of access. But the farther she got into the explanation, the worse it sounded. A stranger from a grief forum, private messages, a phone call, a legal assistant she had never met in person. Security steps completed while someone else reassured her. The representative went quiet in the way people do when they have stopped listening for facts and started listening for liability. Then the second complication landed. She called her sister, not because she wanted to, because she had run out of solo options. Her sister arrived within an hour, sat at the dining table, and read through messages in silence that felt heavier than anger. At first there was only disbelief, then the frantic practical energy of someone trying to salvage a disaster already in progress. Passwords changed, devices checked. Banks called again from a second phone. Notes spread across the table. Names, times, confirmation numbers. And underneath all of that, something else entered the room. A new kind of humiliation. Because this was no longer private shame. It had become visible, shared, spoken aloud by another person. The details that had felt intimate in the dark of her phone screen now looked absurd and dangerous under kitchen lighting. The same messages that once felt tender now read like a dossier of grooming. Every comforting phrase carried a second meaning. Every moment she thought proved connection now looked like evidence of targeting. But the true scale of the damage still had not surfaced. Not yet. At this point, she believed the loss was the pension transfer. Massive, yes. Catastrophic, yes. But singular. Then the fraud review team called back with one more question. Had she recently uploaded identity documents or completed any biometric confirmation tied to the account? That was when she remembered the continuity verification sequence. The assistant had asked for an updated photo identification match because the pension portal's beneficiary safeguards required renewed authentication after a status review. She had complied because the request arrived wrapped in exactly the kind of technical explanation modern systems use every day. Face match, identity continuity, security alignment, words designed to sound protective while they hollow out consent. Now the implication was suddenly wider. This was not just a transfer problem. It was an access problem, potentially an identity problem. The representative did not say the worst thing directly. People in institutions rarely do. They imply it through process. She was advised to monitor credit activity, contact other financial institutions, review tax records, watch for attempt to open or redirect linked accounts, consider a fraud alert, consider a freeze. That was the moment the story outgrew money. Because money can be counted, what followed could spread. And as her sister sat across from her, asking quietly, "Did he know about any other accounts? Did you send him anything else?" She felt a deeper terror begin to take hold. The possibility that the man who had learned the intimate vocabulary of her grief had not only stolen from her present, but had used her dead husband's paperwork as a doorway into everything else still bearing his name. Collapse did not happen in a single cinematic moment. It happened in fragments. A whole music loop that seemed to last an hour. A form she filled out incorrectly because her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Her sister asking the same question twice because she had stopped processing spoken language. A cup of tea going cold beside a stack of printed messages she could no longer bear to read, but could not stop rereading. The practical world kept moving while her internal one gave way. By the second day, every institution involved had its own script. File a report, escalate the review, wait for determination, submit supporting evidence, document all communications, preserve screenshots, do not delete messages, monitor linked accounts, contact local police for an incident number, contact federal agencies if international routing is suspected. Each instruction was sensible. Together, they were unbearable, because every step required her to restate the story from the beginning, and every retelling made her sound less like a victim and more like a participant in her own undoing. She heard it in the pauses on the other end of calls, in the way representatives became more formal once private messaging entered the explanation, in the way "I understand" shifted from empathy to procedure. By then, his silence had become total. The number was dead. The forum profile was gone. The legal assistant's email bounced back. The domain attached to the signature suddenly no longer resolved to anything at all. An entire human relationship had collapsed into empty infrastructure. That was the part she could not metabolize. Not even more than the missing money. At first, the speed with which intimacy had converted into a technical trail. Photos of messages, timestamps, metadata, a call log, PDF copies, authentication records. He had occupied so much emotional space, and now what remained of him fit into evidence folders. Her sister stayed late the second night, and finally said what no one had said directly. He chose you, not you made a mistake. Not how could you, not even he tricked you. He chose you. A widow, alone, tired, still handling the pension paperwork of a dead husband, active in a grief forum where people announce, in careful, honest language, exactly which parts of life have become too heavy to carry alone. The precision of it hit harder than any accusation could have. This was not random fraud, not bad luck, not one careless click. It was hunting. That realization broke something open. She went to the bedroom to get a folder, and ended up on the floor before she understood she was there. Not fainting, not dramatic sobbing, just a total physical failure of structure, as if her body had decided before her mind did that it could not continue performing normal tasks under the weight of what had happened. She cried then, but not cleanly. It came mixed with anger, nausea, disbelief, and something uglier, shame so intense it felt almost primitive, shame that she had offended him in her own head, Shame that she had protected the privacy of the connection. Shame that the last major asset tied to her husband's life had been exposed through her hands. And then, beneath all of it, a grief she recognized. Not new grief, the original one, because the scam had fused itself to the loss that came before it. Every call about the pension required saying her husband's name. Every fraud report reopened the administrative aftermath of his death. Every explanation forced her to revisit the period when she was most exhausted, most isolated, most cognitively compromised by sorrow. The theft did not sit beside bereavement. It tunneled through it. By the end of that week, the likely truth had become impossible to avoid. The pension funds were gone. Recovery was uncertain at best. The institutions were not treating the case as a straightforward, unauthorized theft, and the person she had trusted to help protect her husband's legacy had used that trust as a delivery system for its destruction. This was a collapse. Not just losing money, not just discovering deception, but understanding that the most intimate thing left from her marriage had been turned into a weapon against her. And there was still one thought she could not stop hearing, even in the silence after everyone else had gone home. If I had never answered that first message, would his name still feel safe to say? 2 months later, the sound that broke her wasn't a phone call or a knock at the door. It was a notification, a plain system ping, one she used to ignore, followed by the tiny banner that slid across her screen. Document available, distribution summary. She was standing in the kitchen, holding a grocery list with 3 items on it, because budgeting had become a daily math problem. She stared at the banner the way someone stares at a wasp inside a glass. Small, ordinary, potentially lethal if you move wrong. When she finally opened it, the language was clinical, a record of what had happened to her husband's pension, rendered as if it were a routine choice made by a living person on a normal Tuesday. It wasn't just that money had left the account. It was how it left. The pension hadn't been partially accessed, the way she kept telling herself in the early panic, like maybe only a portion had been exposed, maybe the rest could be protected. It had been converted, accelerated, and dispersed in a way that didn't just remove a balance. It collapsed an entire future. The retirement plan her husband had built wasn't a single pile of cash sitting in a digital box. It was a structure. Survivor benefits, scheduled payments, protections designed to keep a spouse from falling off a cliff after death. And now it read like someone had taken a crowbar to the foundation. Her fraud dispute results arrived a week after that, and it was almost worse because it was so short. The determination used the same word she'd already come to hate. Authorized. The institution expressed sympathy. It explained policy. It offered resources. It suggested reporting the crime to the appropriate agencies. It did not replace what was gone. When her sister tried to argue the case, grooming, coercion, misrepresentation, a calculated social engineering scheme. The response came back in a language of systems that only know 2 kinds of truth, credentialed and not credentialed. If the codes were entered, if the confirmations were approved, if the session came from her device, the machine treated the rest as a human problem. And human problems, she learned, are rarely reimbursed. After that, the damage moved into her body. Sleep became fractured, 2 hours at a time, waking with the certainty that she had forgotten something critical. She started checking locks again, even though no one had ever come to her house. She stopped opening emails in the morning because the sight of verification or secure or review made her heart race. She avoided her phone after dark because that was when he used to appear, steady, soothing, always there, until the night he wasn't. The worst part was what happened to her grief. The forum that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a crime scene. She tried to go back once just to read, and her throat tightened when she saw the familiar threads. New widows writing the same sentences she had written, people confessing the same fears, asking the same practical questions with the same exhausted honesty. She didn't feel comfort. She felt alarm. She wanted to scream into the screen, "Don't answer the one who sounds like he's reading your mind." But she didn't post, because then she'd have to explain. And explaining meant admitting, again, that her husband's last gift to her had been taken through her own hands. Even family changed around her, not with cruelty, worse than cruelty, with caution. Loved ones began double-checking her decisions in small ways, offering to handle things for her, asking for copies. suggesting she let someone else manage accounts for a while. All well-intended, all reasonable, and each one quietly reinforced the same message. We can't fully trust your judgment right now. So she got quieter, more careful, more alone, and in the silence, one thought returned, sharp and repetitive. If he could counterfeit understanding that perfectly, if he could wear empathy like a mask, then what does real empathy look like anymore? There was no clean ending, no arrest she could point to, no dramatic recovery, no moment where the system corrected itself and restored what had been taken. What she got instead was something quieter and harder, a life that continued. The bills still arrived. The house still needed heat. Groceries still had to be bought. Prescriptions still had to be refilled, and every ordinary task now carried a second shadow. The knowledge that security, once broken in the right place, does not return in the same shape. Over time, she became fluent in a new kind of vigilance. She no longer trusted private messages that arrived too perfectly timed. She no longer believed that emotional accuracy proved moral intent. She learned to pause when someone tried to become essential too quickly, to take screenshots before replying, to ask, almost clinically now, who else knows this person exists? Who can verify this with me? What happens if I say no? These were useful habits. They were also evidence of damage, because caution had replaced ease in places where ease used to live. Compassion now required verification. Connection required friction. Even support had to be audited. And maybe that is the most difficult thing to explain about scams built on intimacy. The theft does not end with the transfer. It keeps working long after the money is gone. It alters the victim's relationship to warmth itself. It teaches them that comfort can be engineered, that tenderness can be synthetic, that the sentence which finally makes you feel less alone may, in the wrong hands, be nothing more than a tool. She still thought about the first reply he sent her on the forum. Not every day, but often enough. She could still remember the exact sensation of reading it and feeling some locked interior door open a few inches. Not because it was romantic, not because it was miraculous, because it seemed to prove that someone else, somewhere, understood the hidden dimensions of what she was carrying. That is what made the betrayal so complete. He did not invent a fantasy and lure her into it. He entered a real wound and made himself useful there. In the end, what was stolen was larger than a pension, though the pension was devastating enough. He took the final financial structure her husband had left behind. He attached shame to memory. He turned the support space into a source of dread. And he forced her to live with the unbearable arithmetic of modern exploitation. That a stranger can study human pain closely enough to impersonate care. There are people who will hear a story like this and reduce it to a lesson about being gullible online. That is the easiest reading and the laziest. The harder truth is more unsettling. Most people do not fall for scams because they are foolish. They fall because, at exactly the wrong moment, someone offers relief in the shape they most need. And when that relief is tailored to grief, suspicion can feel almost inhuman. She still keeps one printed photograph of her husband on the shelf near the kitchen window. In it, he is leaning slightly out of frame, caught mid-laugh, as if the person behind the camera said something he didn't expect. For a long time after the theft, she couldn't look at that photo without feeling she had failed him. Now she looks at it differently, not with peace, maybe not even with forgiveness, just with the growing understanding that love leaves people exposed in ways systems still do not know how to protect. The money is gone, the account is closed, the profile vanished, but the most haunting part remains this. The worst stranger she ever met first appeared as the only person who seemed to understand her grief.